Hey guys, thanks for being part of a group. Man, we're so grateful you choosing to be a part of what God is doing here at Vaughn Forest. And if you're new with us, man, thank you guys so much. I hope that you are connecting here and that God is working in your life. Man, we've had a blast the last 2 weeks in this series, Combat Ready, and really excited about today's session 3, and then next week will be our last part of Combat Ready. I hope that God has used this in your life to really equip you and give you some nuts and bolts on how you can overcome the spiritual challenges in your life, the spiritual attack, so that you can really live in the freedom that Christ offers. The last 2 weeks we've talked about God's armor. The first week, session 1, we talked about God's armor and how we're called to put that on. And it's not putting on our strength, but it's putting on the strength of God. And I hope that that was an encouragement to you. And then last week we talked about overcoming the strongholds in our life. And man, I hope that that was a great time as we talked about the 3 keys to overcoming strongholds. If you missed out on those, you can check that out online and watch those for yourself. And you can also watch the messages as well. Today, I want to talk to you about winning. You know, talking about being combat ready is so that we can win. None of us want to lose spiritually. I think all of us would say, man, I want to win. I want to be victorious, but I think if we're honest, many of us feel like we are losing. Spiritually, you feel like you're just at a place where you're just getting run over. You're not winning spiritually. Yeah, you're coming to church, you're in a group, that's wonderful, but man, on a day-to-day basis, you just feel like you are losing. And I want to talk to you guys about what I believe is the secret to winning. How do you win spiritually? And in the most simplistic way that I can tell you is winning happens spiritually when no one else is looking. You see, we win when we do the small things right. When we do the things when nobody else is watching. It's called integrity. You know, character is built when you are doing the things that no one else sees. When you do those things right, that's when God trusts you with more. That is when you win, is when no one else is looking. I'm reminded of Luke chapter 16, verse 10. Check out what God says in His word right here. He says, whoever can be trusted with very little can also be trusted with much. And whoever is dishonest with very little will also be dishonest with much. You see, it's when we're honest and we're faithful with little that we can be faithful with more. You know, people always want more. You know, that's just our nature. But let me ask you a question. Are you being faithful right now? Are you being faithful with what you have? Because something I've learned along the way is God doesn't seem to give more until we're faithful with what we have. And even being faithful with what we have, sometimes the timeline is not the timeline we want because God knows us better than we know ourselves. And He knows whether or not our character is ready for more. It is in those private moments, in that quiet, when no one else knows, that our character is built, that we win spiritually, that we become combat ready. As I was thinking about this session and this message, I was thinking about 3 guys in the Old Testament in the book of Daniel. This is one of my favorite stories in the Old Testament. I love it because you see just the incredible integrity and courage of 3 guys who are willing to win for God no matter what the cost. And they've got very interesting names. Their names are SHADRACH, MESHACH, and ABEDNEGO. I don't know if you've ever heard this story or not, but man, it is an incredible story. And it all begins with this specific situation in Daniel chapter 3. And you have this king who's a very powerful king known as King Nebuchadnezzar. And King Nebuchadnezzar sets up a statue, a gold statue of himself that's 90 feet tall and 9 feet wide. And King Nebuchadnezzar calls for everybody in the land, and this includes Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who are Jewish guys who are living in a pagan culture. They're living in a pagan land. And they are called to bow down and worship this false god. Well, when that happens in their lives, I know that those guys are reminded to worship the Lord your God alone. To not worship any other god before me. The 10 Commandments, they're reminded of that commandment to worship no other God before their God. Well, here they are in a situation where they are called in front of all these people to bow down and worship a false god. And here's what the king says. He says, if you don't bow down and worship me, I'm taking you out, man. You're gone. You're dead. You're not going to exist anymore. Now, I want you to think about that. Can you imagine the pressure that these guys must have felt? Can you imagine the intensity of the situation that if you don't bow down and worship this false god, I'm going to eliminate you. I'm going to kill you. Now, in verse 13, I want to pick up there because what happens is Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego choose not to bow down and worship the false god. But in this pagan culture, they stood strong and they remained faithful to God in the midst of this intense situation. After that happens, this is what happens when Nebuchadnezzar realizes that these three guys choose not to bow down and worship this false god. It says, furious with rage, Nebuchadnezzar summoned Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. So these men were brought before the king. And Nebuchadnezzar said to them, is it true, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, that you do not serve my gods and worship the image of gold that I have set up? Now, when you hear the sound of the horn, the flute, the zither, the lyre, the harp, the pipes, and all kinds of music, if you are ready to fall down and worship the image I have made, very good. But if you do not worship it, you will be thrown immediately into a blazing furnace. Then what God will be able to rescue you from my hand? Man, so after they do it publicly and they choose not to bow down and worship this false god, the king brings them up and calls them to the carpet and says, listen guys, if you don't bow down and worship this god, I'm going to throw you into that furnace and burn you up. Well, of course, the music starts to play and Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego don't bow down and worship. Well, can you imagine the intense anger of the king? It doesn't turn out very good. And I want you guys to notice what happens next. In verse 22, it says, the king's command was so urgent and the furnace was so hot because he turned it up 7 times hotter. It says that fire killed the soldiers who took Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego. And these 3 men, firmly tied, fell into the furnace. So they were put into the furnace. Verse 24, it says, then King Nebuchadnezzar leaped to his feet in amazement and asked his advisors, weren't there 3 men that we tied up and threw into the furnace? They replied, certainly, O king. There were 3. He said, look, I see 4 men walking around in the fire unbound and unharmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Now, I want you to think about this. Here these 3 guys are. They think their life is going to end, but they believe in God so much. They've been faithful to God their whole lives in the small things. Now the big test comes. The big test is when the heat is turned up, and it literally was turned up 7 times hotter, will they believe in God? The heat was so hot that the men that threw them into the fire immediately burned up. But yet here these 3 men thrown into the furnace are walking around inside this furnace that burned up men immediately when they were thrown in. And yet there's a 4th walking with them. I love this story because it's a picture of what Christ does for us. It's a picture of the Christ who is to come that will stand with you and me in the fiery furnace. That he will stand by our side in the midst of difficulties if we stand true and we remain faithful in the small things. We are able to remain faithful in the big things. You see, it was in their integrity. It was their integrity that was built in the small things, in their private time with God, that made them be able to stand when their greatest test would come, when their lives would be put on the line. I love what the Bible says. It continues with this story. And it says, I see 4 men walking around in the fire, unbound and unarmed, and the 4th looks like a son of the gods. Nebuchadnezzar then approached the opening of the blazing furnace and he shouted, Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, come out of the fire. I mean, how these guys must have come out of the fire, right? Come out of the fire. And the satraps, prefects, governors, and royal advisors crowded around them. They saw that the fire had not harmed their bodies, nor was a hair on their heads singed. Amazing. Their robes were not scorched, and there was no smell of fire on them. Wow, what an amazing God we serve. It goes on and it says, then Nebuchadnezzar said, praise be to the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, who has sent his angel and rescued his servants. They trusted in him and defiled the king's commands and were willing to give up their lives rather than serve or worship any God except their own God. Man, when I read those words, I'm like, do I have that kind of faith? Do I trust you enough, God, to be faithful when no one is looking, so when the heat is turned up, I will be faithful in the most challenging times in my lives? You see, to be combat ready to win means to be faithful with where you are right now. Not to beg God for more, but to be faithful with what you have. And when you are faithful, God will bring more. Now I want you to notice what happens next. In verse 29 it says, therefore, the king says, I decree that the people of any nation or language who say anything against the God of Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego be cut into pieces and their houses be turned into piles of rubble, for no other God can save in this way. No other God. Then the king promoted Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego in the province of Babylon. Here these guys are in Babylon, in a foreign pagan land, and yet the greatest test of their life would come. And they stood firm and they believed in their God. As you read their story, it's obvious that they had been faithful to God, that they had a relationship with God, and God gave them a bigger stage. And in the very eyes of their enemy, they stood firm. They didn't bow down. And what's so crazy is this king who was worshiping himself with a 90-foot statue that's 9 feet wide is now claiming that no other God can save like their God. You see, as we face the challenges of this life, our testimony has huge implications as we are challenged, and we want to have other people do the same thing that Nebuchadnezzar did here, to call out and say, there is no other God like this God. Now, can you imagine the impact that this had on the lives of so many people when they saw the faith of these three men? As we fight, as we strive to win, what kind of impact will we have? Will we bow down and give in to the attack of the enemy and worship false gods that are surrounding us? Or will we stand firm and honor God? Because it's interesting at the very end that these guys get promoted in a pagan land by a pagan king. You see, God controls everything. The most powerful king in the world is under the command of our God. And so as we talk about being combat ready, man, I hope that you guys have an incredible discussion in your group about how we can win spiritually. Thanks.